North Korea and Iran. Now, we're live on Facebook and YouTube, so please send us your comments and questions. And oh boy, how fast things do change. Now hopes for a deal to denuclearize North Korea are in doubt. In a statement Wednesday, a U-turn by North Korea, its vice foreign minister expressed indignation at the uncompromising position by the United States that Pyongyang give up its nuclear weapons and their delivery methods. Specifically, the vice foreign minister pointed to remarks made in my interview with U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton, which were posted a few days ago on voanews.com and which you will hear in a moment. But Bolton told me that negotiations with North Korea are not going to be lengthy, not going to be, in his words, drag out for a long period of time. He also said the U.S. is not going to move off its position of complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization of North Korea. Now, here's the first part of my interview with U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton. All right, so who made the first gesture, the United States to North Korea, to Kim Jong-un, or Kim Jong-un to the United States to having this summit?
Well, you know, as President Trump says, what exactly has he given up so far? The fact is that President Clinton wanted to go to North Korea at the end of his administration. He couldn't quite work it. And other presidents have thought about it as well. We'll see, I think, very quickly. I really think President Trump is clear-eyed about the prospects here. He's optimistic because he'd like to make a deal, but I don't think we're going to get taken in like prior administrations.
What's the hint that North Korea actually wants to deal?
Well, the fact that they've most recently, again, in what's called the Panmunjom Declaration, the document that came out of the North-South Korean summit at the end of April, commits North Korea to complete denuclearization. And that means that if they're serious, if they've made a strategic decision to give up nuclear weapons, they've got a chance to demonstrate it to President Trump directly in Singapore on June the 12th. And if they haven't made that strategic decision, I don't think he's going to be misled.
What would be the motive to say it and not do it?
Well, look, it's possible. I hope this is not true, but it's possible. They think in North Korea they can do the same thing to us they've done to 3 previous administrations and negotiate, buy time, get resources in exchange for commitments they don't intend to live up to. I think they're going to find they've got a different president here, somebody who knows how to make a deal and enforce it, and we'll see what happens.
One of the things that's been pointed out is that North Korea's made an announcement they're going to freeze their testing. There are also reports that where they did their testing last September, that mountain that has collapsed, and there could be an ecological disaster. The whole area could be contaminated. Do you have any information as to whether they announced they're freezing their testing because they're doing it as part of good faith gesture to the United States and to the discussions, or is it because they got trouble?
Look, it's possible it's part of a good faith gesture. It's entirely possible that's what they're doing. It's also possible, as we've seen in cases like Iran or North Korea itself, they've run into difficulties, so they're making a virtue out of necessity. I hope it's the former, but one of the reasons that the short period of time between the agreement to meet between the 2 leaders and the actual meeting is important is North Korea is not going to get a lot of benefit here out of a lengthy negotiation. This is going to be very quick. I think the 2 sides will size each other up, and President Trump will have a chance to look Kim in the eye and decide whether he really is serious.
Is the serious on the June 12th, is it going to be, are you willing to give up the nuclear weapons totals? That's going to be the questions put on the table.
Yeah, look, denuclearization has a history here. In 1992, the North Koreans agreed not only to give up nuclear weapons, but to give up the front end, uranium enrichment, and the back end, plutonium reprocessing. So we're not really asking them on the nuclear side to do more than what they agreed to before. We are also going to talk about chemical and biological weapons. We're going to talk about their missiles. We're going to talk about their abduction of Japanese and South Korean citizens. We've got our 3 American hostages out, so that's good news. But I think it's all right there. And if the North Korean regime has made that critical strategic decision to get out of the weapons of mass destruction business, then we have a chance for progress.
But why are they selling? This is what I don't understand, is that not only are they making the announcement, at least we're reading about it, that they're willing to denuclearize and that they've frozen their testing, but they also returned 3 Americans, and they haven't sort of asked for any quid pro quo. You know, what's your thinking about what's going on in their mind?
Look, if you believe after evaluation that you're actually safer and better off without pursuing nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons, it's not hard to give them up because you're getting to a better place. You're getting to real security rather than the false security of a weapons program. Whether they've made that decision or not, we can't tell.
But why now? And they've got a history. It's not like they've got a history of taking care of their people, worrying about the security of their people. I mean, their people have been starving. You hear horrible stories about the prison camps that they have. Like, why suddenly is he, would he suddenly care about his people and care about the security?
Because they've never seen the level of economic and political pressure that's been put on them by the president's campaign. But we've got the meeting now, and so I think that's accomplished its objective. Now the test is, are they serious? Will they go ahead?
Has China stepped up its commitment to this? Because I thought it was interesting that not only that Kim Jong-un made one trip, but made a second trip to China right away. Do you see a change in sort of how China's approaching this?
Well, the president had an excellent conversation with Xi Jinping just a few days ago. He's made it very clear we're not letting up on the pressure while the preparations for the meeting go ahead. So this is, in effect, a test for China as well, whether they're prepared to back an effort much more serious than earlier negotiations like the six-party talks, but where the parties get to the end result in very short order. This isn't going to drag out for a long period of time, and that'll be part of the demonstration of sincerity on North Korea's side.
Have they asked for anything from us? They've returned the 3 Americans, and they say they're going to do, or at least the reports are, the denuclearize. Have they said, but when you come here, you better be prepared to X?
Yeah, well, they want a peace treaty. They want an end to the hostilities on the Korean Peninsula. The South Koreans want the same thing. Look, we all want peace on the Korean Peninsula after all these years. And we can get to that, but to get to that, there has to be complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization. That is absolutely clear.
What about our troops in South Korea? Is that on the table?
No, they're not a bargaining chip here. Look, if one day the two Koreas reunited, you'd have a different strategic situation. That's nowhere close to where we are now.
And is South Korea willing to sign a peace agreement to end that war with North Korea?
Well, I think the South Koreans have been very open and transparent with us. I must say we've had excellent conversations between President Moon Jae-in, President Trump, my South Korean counterpart, Mike Pompeo, and the South Korean foreign minister. Cooperation could not be better. They'd like to see this succeed, but they understand, and very clearly, that they don't get to that question until we get denuclearization.
Okay, so we'll know things pretty quickly, or at least the president and his team will know things pretty quickly after June 12th. Let's assume that this goes south and that President Trump decides that Kim Jong-un didn't come with good heart and good mind to talk about doing this, and he has no intention. Then what?
Well, you don't want to predict the worst result coming out of it, but the president himself has said if he doesn't think it's serious, he's prepared with respect to get up and walk away. We'll see.
Walk away and do what, though? Because their nuclear weapons program has been progressing and the clock is running.
And the economic pressure has been progressing too. That's why I think the president is hopeful that maybe there really is a change in behavior. We've never been at this point before. It's
pretty interesting, isn't it? I mean, this is a big chance for Japan, for China, for the rest of the world.
The stakes have never been higher, but I don't think we would have been here if President Trump had followed the same policies as previous administrations. A lot of people said, this is very risky the way he's proceeding, but the upside here is potentially enormous.
Do you intend to go?
I'll be there.
Let's bring in the 2 foreign policy national security experts. Lauren DeYoung-Schulman is a Deputy Director of Studies and Senior Fellow at the Center for a New American Security. Lauren was a Senior Advisor to President Obama's National Security Advisor, Ambassador Susan Rice, and she was Special Assistant to former Defense Secretary Robert Gates. Niall Gardner is with the Heritage Foundation. He is a former aide to former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and recently named one of the 50 most influential Britons in the United States. Nice to see both of you. Let me go first to you, Niall. Is the ambassador, he was his ambassador as National Security Advisor, John Bolton, uses rather muscular words about North Korea. Is that a good approach at this point?
Well, I think you have to demonstrate a robust approach and real strength and resolve in the face of the North Korean threat, because I think that's the only language actually that the North Korean regime understands. And the fact that they're now coming to the negotiating table, hopefully on June 12th in Singapore, is, I think, a testament to the fact that you do have a tougher approach being taken by the present US administration. I think the North Koreans recognize that. And that's why they're coming to the negotiating table. So I do think Ambassador Bolton is certainly sending the right message to Pyongyang.
Lauren, I wonder if some of that isn't backfiring, though, because you've got from the North Korean foreign minister making this statement in part. U.S. is miscalculating the magnanimity and broad-mindedness of North Korea as signs of weakness and trying to embellish and advertise it as these are the products of sanctions and pressure. And you have that in the face of North Korea releasing 3 Americans, meeting with South Korea, agreeing to meet and go to the summit, agreeing to to put a freeze on their missile program and their weapons program, nuclear weapons. Has the Trump administration overstepped it at this point?
Well, I think what the North Koreans are doing are trying to exploit differences or perceived differences between Secretary Pompeo, National Security Advisor Bolton, and possibly the president himself. On Sunday, when you did your interview, Bolton had, as you said, a very muscular statement about what our objectives are in North Korea. Secretary Pompeo's objectives were a little all over the place. He had a slightly more minimalist posture in terms of what he thinks we should try to accomplish at this summit. The president himself, despite what Bolton said, has put U.S. troops on the Korean Peninsula on the table. In seeing these inconsistencies, we're letting Pyongyang choose between which version they like best, and we're kind of freaking out our allies.
You know, now it's hugely significant that Kim Jong-un is coming to the table and doing the summit with the president. And you know, having someone at the table is they're usually not shooting at you while you have the person at the table. Yet the Trump administration says this is not going to be a lengthy negotiation. What do you see in that? Because I see as long as they're at the table talking, they're not out there building weapons. Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, in theory, it's a promising development here, and the fact that the North Koreans are not testing ballistic missiles is a very positive development. And I think that, you know, certainly the president's approach to these negotiations has been the right one. If the North Koreans are willing to be reasonable, to negotiate, and to seek a better future for their own country as part of the international community, that's great. If they're not willing to do that as part of the negotiation, then the president's simply going to walk away. And I think the stakes are, of course, extremely high, but I think on the US side, there's a very clear acknowledgement that you know, we're dealing with one of the most brutal, barbaric regimes on the face of the earth. And if they're not willing to negotiate in good faith, then the United States is going to simply walk away from that. And I do think there's a common agreement between John Bolton, Secretary of State Pompeo, and the President on this matter.
One of the things the foreign minister of North Korea said, look, you know, I'm paraphrasing obviously, is that we see what happened in Libya with Gaddafi and Iraq with Saddam. And so, I mean, obviously, I think they're playing that card against the United States as the United States comes to the table at this summit.
I think what they're betting on with that is hoping that President Trump does not want to walk away from this summit. He sees the possibility of a Nobel Prize in his future. He wants to make...
Or, I mean, to give him fair, or he may see the end of nuclear weapons in the peninsula. I mean, it's like, you know, it depends which side of the aisle you're on.
Either way, I mean, these are objectives that I think either side could be happy about. But at the same time, to the extent that the North Koreans are able to get the Trump administration to walk back on some of their objectives, which I think is what they're hoping for right now, in terms of releasing this statement and trying to point out how the Libya example worked out and how Saddam Hussein, how that worked out for them. If the Kim regime can get the Trump administration to step back a little bit and have lower expectations for the summit, that's a win for them. And the question on the table is, when does the Trump administration decide to back down themselves?
Well, I think the Trump administration made very plain through the president as well as his national security advisor that denuclearization is what is the end game. And I so is biochemical weapons as well, that's the end game. I think what's sort of new, though, is that in recent days I've read that North Korea mentioned something about nuclearization of the United States as being, you know, that's sort of as something new into the equation now.
Yes, I mean,
and that's not going to happen.
Yes,
and that's certainly not going to happen.
If that's their demand, then the United States is not going to be negotiating at all, actually. And so I think, you know, I think that what we're seeing from the North Koreans at the moment is quite a bit of saber rattling, a bit of posturing from the North Korean leader. And this is a man who is not used to, of course, being challenged in any way. And I think that he's sort of, you know, puffing up his feathers a little bit at the moment. So I think there's a lot of posturing from the North Koreans. But let's see how committed they are to actually real dialogue in June.
So let me put the question I gave to Ambassador Bolton. What happens if this goes south? The summit is just an abject failure, it doesn't happen or whatever. What's the next step of the United States? There's some some good news in that the nuclear testing location in North Korea seems to have collapsed so that their program is set back. But what do you see the U.S. doing?
Well, I think the first thing to put on the table here is that there are no military options on the table. We should point out over and over again that the United States' next option here is not a military option.
Is not a military?
It cannot be a military option. There's no way it needs to pursue a military option on the Korean Peninsula that does not involve hundreds of thousands of Americans and South Koreans dying. So our options from there are either negotiations and engagement in another track, perhaps wait a little while, reset, figure out what denuclearization means, since we don't appear to know ourselves yet, or containment and deterrence, which we've been pursuing to some degree for a while. None of those are great options, but it would be nice to have a National Security Council meeting to figure out whether or not the Trump administration wants to pursue one of those or something else.
30 seconds now. Why is Kim Jong-un willing to talk now? Is it the sanctions?
I think partly, but it is actually also his fear of the military option as well. So I do think the military option always has to be reserved as a last resort. And I think the North Korean regime genuinely fears the possibility of the United States taking tougher action if necessary. And so I think you've always got to reserve that. No one ever
Except
wants
they've got all those weapons on the southern border facing at South Korea, all the artillery.
Yeah, it's an immensely complicated situation, but you always want to have the reserve of the use of force as a very last resort. And that, I think, is a key reason why the North Koreans are coming to the table.
All right, now, Lauren, stay with us because North Korea was not the only issue I discussed with Ambassador John Bolton. We also talked about President Trump's foreign policy decisions, especially regarding the Middle East and Iran. Can you tell me, compare and contrast the foreign policy, President Bush 43, President Obama, and President Trump?
Well, I think President Trump, in his campaign, said his objective was to put American national interest first. And I think that's been the hallmark of his first year plus in office. He has inherited a lot of problems, Iran, North Korea, the Middle East, that really were either not addressed or were addressed incorrectly in the Obama administration. And that's a big part of his responsibility. The Bush administration, by contrast, came in with this idea that the world's problems had been solved, the Cold War was over, economic growth was the only issue, and then we hit 9/11. So really, his presidency was very different. But I think President Trump's got a series of problems to resolve, and he's systematically working his way through it.
Well, it's sort of interesting because if you look back historically, like North Korea, for instance, back in the beginning, President Clinton tried to do something, and successive presidents did, and even moving the embassy in Israel, which has been a promise by the U.S. Congress in 1995. President George W. Bush said he was going to do it. President Obama said he was going to do it, and now apparently it is going to be done.
Yeah, well, this goes to the credibility of the United States, and particularly the President of the United States. So when President Trump says, like every other former successful presidential candidate, I plan to move the U.S. Embassy in Israel to Jerusalem, and then he does it, that's not simply something that has an effect on the conditions in Israel, but it says to world leaders all around the world, when he says he's going to do something, he does. And I think, likewise, his recent decision to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal, which he talked about all the time during the campaign and made clear even after he became president, he thought was a terrible deal. By his withdrawal, he simply carried through on what he's been saying consistently for close to 2 years.
What do you expect? Do you expect Iran to come back to the table and negotiate, or is this a standoff between the United States and Iran?
Oh, I don't think it'll be a standoff. I think inevitably as U.S. sanctions kick in, it'll have an effect on Europe. I think their trade and investment with Iran will drop as well. And I think Iran then faces a very difficult choice. They'd love to keep the deal going because of the economic benefits which all pointed in their direction. But those benefits are about to be cut off. The economy's in much more difficult shape. Even after the release of the sanctions, we saw demonstrations all around the country at the end of last year. So I think it's going to be very, very difficult for Iran to sustain this.
What is the reason that the president got out of the Iran deal? I mean, the IAEA said that Iran was in compliance. There was a discussion about whether or not the money from the unfreezed assets, that the money that belonged to Iran that was returned during the Obama administration, that provided a lot of money, and that money has been distributed, and there's a lot of complaints it's distributed to Hezbollah and in Yemen and in Syria to fight Israel. Is that the reason why he got out of the deal?
Well, it's certainly the case, the way Obama negotiated the deal, that front-end benefits went to Iran. And that was one of the fundamental mistakes of it. But at its core, the deal was simply not in America's strategic interest. It did not effectively restrain Iran from continuing to pursue deliverable nuclear weapons. It did not have effective verification mechanisms. We entered the deal without knowing anything other than what our own intelligence had given us on Iran's military program. And the IAEA simply didn't have adequate provisions for inspection. So we know that at the core of the deal was a lie about Iran's military aspirations. And the recent information revealed by Israel only underscores that.
But isn't a deal, number one? And I realize that there's a lie underlined, and that that's what Prime Minister Netanyahu and Israeli intelligence came up with. But isn't a deal, and doesn't that somehow inhibit the United States in making a deal with Kim Jong-un in North Korea?
Well, I don't think any deal that's based on fraud is valid, and so I think that undercuts it to begin with. But it's also the case a president has to look at the strategic interest of the United States. So when George W. Bush withdrew from the anti-ballistic missile treaty, it wasn't because Russia was violating it, although they probably was. It was because the world had changed. And I think in the case of the Iran deal, it was never in America's interest, and it wasn't getting any better with age. I actually think it increases the chances of a deal with North Korea, because North Korea will say to itself, we're obviously not going to get a deal so favorable to us as Iran, and if we want any deal at all, it's going to have to be much more on the U.S. terms.
All right, so who made the first? Let's bring back our analyst, Lauren DeYoung-Schulman from the Center for a New American Security, and Nal Gardner from the Heritage Foundation. Lauren, first you, obviously with foreign policy decisions, you know, it usually takes decades to figure out whether they were a good idea or not based on what happens. It's so hard to predict. But you supported the deal, the Iran deal, and I take it that you do not support President Trump's decision to get out of it. Why?
Well, I mean, the president didn't make it a secret that he wanted to get out of the Iran deal. This was one of his campaign promises, and that's within his right as president to make that decision. But it was done against the advice of his Secretary of Defense. Our intelligence community believes that Iran was supporting the deal and living up to their commitments.
Let me ask you one question on that. Is that in the front end that Ambassador Bolton talked about, there was the unfreezing of the assets, the money, and it is said, reported, that the money is being used to fund Hezbollah, problems in Yemen. They're basically doing the proxy wars with this money, aside from the nuclear part of the deal. What about that? Is that?
Yes,
I mean, are they keeping their word on?
problematic.
Are they keeping their word within that?
They didn't have words within that. The point of the nuclear deal was on the nuclear program. And if the Trump administration wanted to focus on Iran's malign activities in the Middle East, as well as their missile program, then they have other mechanisms to do so. They haven't spent the last 6 months working with our European partners on means to pressure on that. They spent the last 6 months trying to come up with a fix for the Iran deal and effectively ignored it when it was on the table.
Now, let me go back a little bit to North Korea. I mean, and I asked the question of Ambassador Bolton, is how does the United States, I realize that President Obama couldn't get this to be a treaty, because if it were a treaty, then President Trump couldn't just sign away. President Obama didn't have the support for that 2/3 of the Senate back in 2015. But how does President Trump negotiate with Kim Jong-un in light of the fact that, you know, we pulled out of this Iran deal that we signed, and secondly that they see what happened in Iraq with Saddam and in Libya with Gaddafi? I mean, so doesn't that weaken President Trump going into a discussion?
Well, I don't think it weakens the president. I think it does reinforce the message that if the North Koreans want a deal with the United States, that this has to be a reasonable deal that does not serve the interests of North Korea's nuclear ambitions. And I think that's a fundamental difference.
But I think back in 2015, a lot of people who voted for the deal thought it was reasonable and a good one and a smart one at that time. It seems that, you know, now people have it. Now, of course, we've switched parties in power, but now some don't have that thought.
Yeah, I think you know, a key flaw of the Iran nuclear agreement was the sunset provisions in place, which in effect would allow Iran, within the space of about 10 years or so, to resume its nuclear ambitions, basically, and that's fundamentally flawed. Also, the deal, of course, did not impose restrictions on the development of ballistic missiles or any restrictions on Iran's support for terrorist activity. And we've seen a huge rise in Iran's regional nefarious role as a result of that deal. So I think it was fundamentally flawed. We just don't want to see a similar kind of agreement with the North Koreans.
Lauren, big news, of course, the embassy in the United States has moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. President Rouhani of Iran has already spoken out about it, supporting the Palestinians. We now have riots in which there have been a number of deaths, a number of shooting deaths by the Israeli military. This has been going on since 1995. Congress said they're going to move the embassy. President Clinton didn't, although he promised. President George W. Bush didn't. President Obama didn't. And President Trump now did. So your thoughts now?
The role of the National Security Advisor is to tell the president what are the implications of his national security decisions. The implications for this decision that President Trump made to move the embassy was that it's weakened our position to be a negotiator in Israeli-Palestinian politics going forward. And we've had the tragic case of thousands of Palestinians being shot and wounded, and just in the last couple of days, 50 being killed.
And of course, now you've also got a situation where even like Democrats, like Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, a Democrat, was in favor of it. I mean, this has also got a political ramification to it here in the United States.
Well, I think it's important to bear in mind, of course, that the president pledged to put the U.S. embassy.
They all did, though. I mean, he's not the first to do it.
And this was, this has been sort of the established policy of many presidential candidates in the past.
Does it weaken the United States' ability to broker a peace deal between the Palestinians and Israel by appearing to take sides on that?
I don't think it weakens the U.S. Position. At the end of the day, the only realistic prospect of a peace deal is if you see the likes of Hamas, for example, renouncing terrorism. And let's not forget that the Israeli Defense Forces took action because this was a direct threat posed to Israel. These massive protests.
It was not a peaceful protest.
Which were drummed up by Hamas, and I think Hamas, was simply using Palestinian lives for some sort of broader terrorist agenda here, and so Hamas is to blame really for the loss of life.
Thank you both. Thank you both. We gotta leave it there. Thank you. But before we go, a moment to salute the courage of journalists who are covering the deadly protests in the Gaza Strip. The Committee to Protect Journalists say at least 22 Palestinian journalists have been hit by ammunition fired by the Israeli Defense Force since those protests erupted on March 30th. 2 of the journalists died of their wounds. Yasser Mertaja, a 31-year-old cameraman and photojournalist working for On Media, was shot in the abdomen while covering protests in southern Gaza. That was on April 7th. Ahmed Abu Hussein was a Palestinian photographer working for the Gaza-based Voice of the People radio. He was covering protests in northern Gaza when he was shot in the abdomen on April 13th. 1 week later, Ahmed Abu Hussein died of his wounds. He was 24 years old. Both men were wearing protective gear, boldly marked with the words "Press" across their chests. The Committee to Protect Journalists say 27 journalists have been killed so far this year, and just a sad reminder of the real dangers of getting you the news from war and conflict zones. Stay plugged in by liking us on Facebook at Voice America. You can also like my Facebook page at facebook.com/Greta and follow me on Twitter @Greta. Thanks for being plugged in.